Hi, my name is Melissa Varga, and I'm the Science Network Outreach Associate at the Union of Concerned Scientists. I'd like to welcome and thank you for joining the final webinar in the winter slate of the Science Network Workshop Series. Our workshop series is an annual offering of skills-building web-based workshops to help strengthen your voice for science. Today's webinar, Finding the Unconventional Career, Strategies for Early Career Scientists Seeking Opportunities at the Nexus of Science and Policy, will explore the value of scientific training in the policy process, the options available, and the routes for navigating potential career paths. If you'd like to join in the conversation on Twitter during the webinar, you can use the hashtag SciNetWorkshop. And now I'd like to thank and introduce our two workshop facilitators, Laura Grego and Gretchen Goldman. Dr. Laura Grego focuses on nuclear weapons policy with an emphasis on missile defense policy. She is also the author or co-author of more than 20 peer-reviewed published papers on a range of topics. Since joining UCS in September 2002, she has been cited by the Boston Globe, Chicago Tribune, Los Angeles Times, New Scientist, New York Times, Washington Post, and the USA Today, and has appeared on Fox News, the Discovery Channel, and NPR. She has also testified before Congress and addressed the United Nations Conference on Disarmament on Space Security Issues. Before joining UCS, Laura was a postdoctoral researcher at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. She earned a doctorate degree in experimental physics at the California Institute of Technology and a Bachelor of Science degree in physics and astronomy at the University of Michigan. Dr. Gretchen Goldman is an analyst in the Center for Science and Democracy at UCS, where she researches influences and interference in how science is used in decision-making around public policy. Dr. Goldman came to UCS from the Georgia Institute of Technology, where she was a postdoctoral research fellow. Gretchen earned her PhD and master's in environmental engineering from Georgia Tech and a Bachelor of Science degree in atmospheric science from Cornell University. She is the author of several recent UCS reports, including A Climate of Corporate Control, Grading Government Transparency, and Assessing Trade and Business Groups' Positions on Climate Change. And one last housekeeping note before we get started. We encourage you to share your questions and thoughts throughout the presenters' discussion, and we will have ample time for questions at the end. Please use the chat function at the bottom left corner of this window, and we will do our best to respond to as many questions as we can. And from here, Laura will take it away. Thanks, Laura.
Hi, thanks for coming. Melissa and Danielle asked me to just give a brief intro to how I came to work in the nexus of science and policy. I was a postdoc, and I found myself maybe reading the New York Times more often than I was reading Astrophysical Journal or the abstracts. And so I used this picture to kind of illustrate the duality of being a scientist and keeping up with the latest things in the science world, which takes a lot of time, and then looking outward and looking at the problems society has and thinking about how to use my skills to impact that. So when I realized the balance was tipping towards really looking at scientific problems, I spent a year essentially cold calling and finding people that did things I thought were interesting in this nexus. So if I found an interesting paper, I would give a call to that person and see if they could talk to me about what they did. And I kind of covered the waterfront. And usually the last question I would ask is, who else do you think I should be talking to? And pretty often they said I should be talking to the Union of Concerned Scientists. And as it turned out, at that point UCS had a program where they were helping academic scientists make the transition to policy work. And so I benefited from that program, and I ended up really enjoying the work I did here and staying. I've been here for 10 years now. Here we go next. So I figured I would give you just a brief sort of eagle's eye view of what some of the options are in the nexus between science and policy. And I'm mostly looking at this as a scientist doing policy work rather than science policy, the policy of how science goes. But one place people do this work is in academia. So in the field that I work in, the security field, They're people who sort of work in engineering or public policy programs, and they do technical analysis while also performing academic duties and teaching classes. There's also the world of nonprofits and think tanks, places like UCS, Federation of American Scientists, National Resources Defense Council. And then there are also people who do this kind of work in official capacity in the government. So that last picture is Charles Bolden, who is an engineer who's the head of NASA. And when you're thinking about what kinds of jobs you might be interested in, I think it helps to take stock of who you are and what kinds of things that you're drawn to, because these three different buckets, academic jobs, nonprofit jobs, government jobs, kind of emphasize different aspects of doing this work. For example, are you comfortable being a public figure, or are you really more comfortable being sort of a public figure that sometimes that's required of being in the government or in a nonprofit, not so much when you're an academic and you keep a more private profile. Do you like to be on the inside or the outside? Sometimes you work for the government and you're there at the table when decisions are being made, but sometimes you're not able to agitate when you think the wrong decisions are being made. Versus an outsider, sort of an advocacy organization, UCS does some of this work and is able to critique government policies from the outside and isn't quite limited in the same way as somebody who works for the government. So that's one aspect of who am I and what kinds of things do I like to do? Where on the spectrum am I? And then a third thing to think about is, do I like to do pure research and set my own research agenda according to my own interests as they come? Or in a place like sort of the government or think tanks, we're often drawn to problems because there are policy opportunities there, and we might do analysis of a problem, but it's really driven by where the policy opportunities are. The last thing I just wanted to bring up, and we can talk more about all of these things in the discussion, is to talk about what kinds of skills you actually have already as a scientist or a technical person, and what kinds of things that might translate particularly well to policy positions. And things that might be obvious to you or might not. For example, we're trained over and over to really provide rigorous analysis. And you have a strong BS detector. You're presented with information, and you really have, along this time of education and training, really are able to form an informed opinion pretty quickly. Also, a skill that we tend to have developed is to take a complex problem and learn how to break it down into the essential components and decide what parts of the problem are really important and which we can set aside. And that's a really good skill for somebody who's working in the policy world. The next thing is the ability to learn new things. And for example, I work in the global security program, and I was an astrophysicist in my academic life, but daily I'll need to make an assessment on on radars, sensors, sort of bunker busters, all sorts of different kinds of technologies that I wasn't trained to do. But during my scientific and technical training, I learned how to learn something and how to learn it quickly and how to learn the essentials, maybe not the details, but how do you get the sort of order of magnitude things on the most important pieces of a puzzle by sort of learning the essentials. And then the last thing I wanted to say was that we also really have to learn how to do succinct communication of complicated ideas. Because although when we talk to our colleagues in our very close areas of research, we can talk in those very arcane details, but very often we're drawn and required to communicate our research and our research to other colleagues who maybe don't specialize in that, and you have to learn how to break that down and communicate verbally and in the written word. So those are all things that actually translate very well into policy work. And then the last thing I wanted to do is leave you with two quotes, which both came to me through my supervisors, and the people who said these are people that my supervisors worked with. which really kind of encapsulate why we do what we do. And the first, you can read it yourself, is that we need people who can do integrals. You can do integrals. You should do integrals. Not everybody has the skills that you have, the ability to do science and math easily. And this kind of stuff is, super necessary in making good policy decisions. And so I would really encourage you to believe in that value and to bring it to bear on policy questions. And then the second one is that close technical analysis of a problem often leads to surprising and important policy-relevant insights. So if you're one of those people that really likes to look at details and you really like to chew on a problem, even if you like to do that, those skills are super useful in the policy world, because sometimes you miss something that these sort of quick or superficial analyses tend to miss. And so with that, I'm going to leave myself open to questions in the Q&A, but Gretchen Goldman will talk to you next.
All right, thanks, Laura. Laura talked some about some of the skills and experiences that you might already have that would be useful for policy or advocacy careers. But I want to talk to you about how to gain some of the skills and experiences that you might not have, but would help you get a career in policy or in advocacy. And some of these things, a lot of these things are things that you can do while you're in academia, while you're doing other jobs. And I wanted to lead with this photo. This is me as an undergrad and as a ropes course facilitator. And I didn't know what I wanted to do when this photo was taken, but being a ropes course facilitator taught me a lot of hard skills about communication and leadership and all that, but it also changed my views on a lot of different things. First just on outdoor education, and then eventually on environmental issues more broadly. And it ultimately led me to change my career path. And so I wanted to lead with this photo with leading with the idea that of being open to possibilities and letting your diverse experiences shape your direction. And one of my main advice for a lot of people who are looking to get into policy or advocacy is to think about turning your advocacy thoughts into actions. And this is so basic, but it's so important. And I think as a scientist who cares about the issues that you work on and the policy around it and other implications it has for society, you probably do have a lot of knowledge about this area. You probably follow the issue in the news, and you might really care about the science-based decisions be made around that science that you have. But a lot of that knowledge that you might have can't easily help you get a career in that way unless your resume reflects that. And so I think it's important to always remember that to think about how you can actually interpret that into something that you can do on the ground. And you'd be surprised how many people that I meet who have really strong passions for something and are really knowledgeable about the issue and are passionate advocates for the solution, but they don't necessarily have anything to show for it to a potential employer. So I think thinking about that's really important. And the good thing is that can take a lot of different forms. Even if your topic is really high level and doesn't exactly translate to you doing volunteer activities on the weekend. There's still other things you can do, a lot of work, for example, on blogging or newspaper op-eds or other outlets of thinking about how you can apply that science in other places. And this brings me to my next point, which is to not be afraid to get your hands dirty. So what this means is that even if you have no idea even if you just don't know what you want to do, it's really important to start from the ground up. And so this has a few purposes. It can help turn your advocacy thoughts into action, like I said, but it can also inform your understanding of the issue and how you can apply that, how it gets applied in the social context. This is me making a worm bin, but this was just to show that I gained a lot of knowledge about how environmental engineering principles are applied in practice just from talking to gardeners, to staff at landfills, or staff at recycling facilities, because these are the people that are using that science in other contexts, and so that's really important. And especially if you're a mid-career scientist and you're looking to make a career change, a lot of this kind of thing might feel like a step down, but I think it can really prove to be invaluable if you are willing to get your hands dirty. And I did want to just mention that even if you have no idea where you want to take your science, and there's a few things that you can do that will always be good as an early career scientist or to someone considering an unconventional career in advocacy or in policy. And the first of these is communication. We've, of course, all heard this from career counselors. But I do want to just stress the fact that this word means different things if you're in an academic setting versus in a policy or advocacy setting. And so as a scientist, you probably have a really good record of technical writing and technical talks. And this is really good if you want to stay in the science. But if you're looking to move into advocacy or policy, it'll be really important to have some non-technical examples of your ability to read and write. And this can really help. And if you're a scientist that can do those things really well, it's a really good combination of a set of skills to have. And so you can think about what are ways to get that out there. And there's a few ways to do it, but one really easy one that comes up nowadays is to be active on social media. So think about starting a blog or being active on Twitter, or other things where you can exercise some non-technical communication skills. And I want to plug in a few weeks, the Science Network will have an event specifically looking at scientists' use of social media. So stay tuned for that as well. And next, organization. So I'm using this in place of where you would normally see the word leadership. But I think we should think of leadership building as pursuing opportunities to demonstrate your ability to organize. And so this means organizing events. It could mean demonstrating that you can meet deadlines, that you can manage people, money, that you can multitask. And these are really important skills that might not necessarily be valued in an academic setting or if you're in another scientifically oriented setting. But it's really important if you're looking to get into advocacy or into policy. And I want to note on this one is that a lot of opportunities for this, for organization, might come in the form of the last thing that you want to do. And so I think we should keep that in mind, that even though it's not gonna appear to be a great opportunity, it is requiring work. But a lot of times that can make a difference in being able to demonstrate that you have these other skill sets that aren't necessarily within your academic portfolio. And if you take one thing away from my talk, I think I want it to be this one. And this is learning how your science fits. And so what this means is thinking about how your science fits into the broader world, because the way that it's used in your scientific field is of course very different, right? In grad school or as a postdoc, you'll learn the intricate complexities of your scientific field, but very few of these intricacies will matter when you step outside of your lab and into business or politics or law, for example. And as an example of this, in graduate school, I once attended a court case hearing that concerned my scientific field. And so I got to listen to how lawyers talked about it and how that was used in that setting. And it was one of the more enlightening experiences I had in grad school, because it allowed me to really see how different it was that they talked about it, and what parts of the science actually get translated when we're talking about the way it's handled in other fields. And lastly, you want to think about just building that track record for policy or advocacy. And just think about adding activities or publications or anything that sort of demonstrates your interest in policy or advocacy in general. When I'm looking at resumes for science policy positions here, I'm often not looking for a specific advocacy experience or knowledge of a specific policy proposal, but I'm looking to see that a candidate demonstrates that they have a consistent interest in science policy issues. And lastly, I just want to say to take my advice with a grain of salt. And I know it might sound odd that my last piece of advice is to not take my advice, but I've talked to a lot of different people about career advice along the way in my path, and when I was originally deciding whether or not I even wanted to stay in science or get a grad degree in something else. And I just think it's important to remember that people will always tend to tell you to do what they did, and there's of course a different path that makes sense for everyone. And so ultimately that means you should talk to a lot of people and figure out what works best for you. And with that, I think we'll move into a question and answer period, and I'll pass it back to Melissa.
Great. Thank you so much, Gretchen and Laura. I think we have a couple questions here already, and everyone should feel free to submit questions through the chat box so we can keep the Q&A going. Let's start with this first question from Lauren. What's the best way to explain the value of science and research knowledge in a non-scientific position?
I think this is a good question because a lot of, as scientists, I think we think about this a lot because the way that we would talk about it isn't necessarily how others would perceive it. I found for me that what works best is to just spend a lot of time around and listening to people in other fields. Learn about what they value and how they think about it and what part of your science matters to them, and really trying to see it from their perspective, and as opposed to just trying to convince them of the way that you value it. And I think really just that thinking about it from the other side can be helpful.
I think, again, what I mentioned in my talk, the value of really good, finely honed critical thinking skills, the ability to, the BS detector, the ability to really look at a problem, break it down, I think applies, it's a transferable skill outside of science to non-science positions.
Great. Okay, we have another question here from an attendee. How important is working for the private sector, not startups, but for instance Chevron, before entering the policy arena to regulate them?
I can start and try to take that. I think there's a lot of benefit to doing it different ways, right? To try to, right, as Laura sort of mentioned, this inside versus outside dynamic, right, and how you understand things. I think I know people who have done it sort of both ways, either start working for industry or start working for the government and then move to an advocacy organization that pushes for that, or UCS has a few people that have gone the other way and they were advocates but now work for industry or for the government. I think having different experiences definitely always enhances your perspective. So I think it might depend ultimately on your goal. If if you really want to be the watchdog, it might help to have the experience from the inside first, and but you'd also want to think about what sort of having it, if whether or not doing one thing will limit your opportunities to do the other. Because there is sort of, to some extent, when we graduate with our degrees, you're a little bit more of a clean slate as far as being able to take different paths, whereas once we might have more of a label of being a particular kind of scientist, a private sector scientist or an advocate or a government scientist, in some ways it might be harder to transfer. It really depends on the situation, but I think it's a good thing to think about.
I would add that so my field is security, and it's a little different. But I have colleagues, for example, one who used to be a nuclear reactor operator and engineer, and another who used to be a missileer who was in charge of basically manning our ICBMs, nuclear weapons. And what has been helpful for them, I think, is a deep understanding of the cultures of those organizations, which can be really different to the cultures that we've been in. So, an academic culture is very different from military culture and very different from an engineering culture. So the ability to straddle those worlds, I think, has proven really valuable to them. So if it's that kind of experience is great. If that's an option, I think it's often very useful. We sometimes talk about the we work on security issues, and there are some aspects to that which would be classified, but sometimes, and we've found this with colleagues, when you have access to all classified information, sometimes you don't see the forest for the trees, and an outside perspective can sometimes be just as useful or more useful and provide insights that you don't see from the inside. So I think being able to have a variety of experiences, I think ideally inside and outside, if your temperament can support that, I think it's always useful.
All right. Since we mentioned government jobs, Pamela has a question. What types of government and international opportunities are available, and how do you get to learn about and apply for those positions?
Well, certainly one of the fantastic programs are we have congressional fellowships, some sponsored by the AAAS, some by the National Science Foundation, which allow scientists to work in government for a year or 2 years. And I don't remember the details because I didn't go in those programs, but they are a fantastic opportunity to make this transition from academia to government work. They're really competitive, and so the people who end up being able to take advantage of those opportunities, I think, have been well prepared ahead of time with some of these things that Gretchen has mentioned. Yes, and I think this gives me just the opening to say networking and cold calling and asking people who else to talk to is always one of the best ways to find out about these kinds of things. So it's a good start to be on this webinar.
Yeah, I would say I would just add to what Laura said that fellowships are definitely a good entry point because a lot of them you don't need any specific policy experience necessarily to get into it. And there's beyond the AAAS fellowships that Laura mentioned, there's also a lot of scientific societies have them. So depending on your specific field, I know there's a lot of them will have some fellowships that either put you on the Hill or in other policy settings. If you're not a PhD scientist, there's a few other opportunities. There's the Presidential Management Fellows that some people do to try to get into the government. There's Merzion Fellowships, which are a little shorter, and they put you in the national academies. And those you don't have to have graduated yet to get, so that's another good option. They're just 3-month ones. And another thing, if you're either not a U.S. citizen or just looking for a different perspective, and another potential way in, and now it's of course hard with limited federal job openings, but another way is to try to be a contractor. So if you can work with the federal government on things either through a consulting firm or through contractors that work directly with the government only, that can be another way to sort of get your foot in the door with federal work without needing to be on the federal payroll yet.
Great. We are getting a lot of excellent questions coming in. Please keep sending them our way. Another question here from Karen. Do you have any advice for mid-career academics or others thinking of career changes in terms of transitioning? So I think this is asking more about not necessarily early career scientists, but mid-career scientists.
Sure. Well, the fellowships that we mentioned are not limited to early career. Some of them I think you have to have graduated recently, but I know the AAAS one is not. It's certainly used as a mid-career switch by many people. I think in some ways it could give you an advantage in that you have a lot more experience and networks and have your way around in a lot of other areas. So I think it can be helpful. And another thing to keep in mind is that at least we know we have at least one person on staff who did this as a mid-career change, and he found it helpful to sort of take a step down, and it of course would be painful to take a pay cut or anything like that, but he found it to be useful to just get him that policy experience that he needed to be able to get back up to where he wanted to be in terms of a science policy position. So I would say that'd be another thing, is just don't immediately turn down any opportunity that doesn't seem like it's quite at your level, because it might just be a good leg up onto making that switch.
I guess the other thing that I would add is that it's a good time to be thinking about those things because you've probably completed your degree at that point. And not that the only path is through a PhD, but it is definitely something that lends a sort of shorthand of credibility in the policy world when you have a doctorate degree. It speaks to the commitment and the level of sort of intellectual energy expended. So it's a really useful degree to have. So if you're thinking about a policy switch while you're still in grad school, my advice is almost always to just stick it out if you can and finish that degree. And so as a mid-career person, hopefully you've already done that journey.
All right, we have a question from Gordon. How can scientists get involved not as specific issue advocates, but more generally in policy, for example, in the relation between science and democracy, which sounds like what we do here at UCS for the Center for Science and Democracy?
Sure. I would first say, Gordon, we need people like you. We need a lot of people that are, bigger advocates or more aware of the issues in general of how do we even be able to be issue advocates on science-based issues. We need a system that allows us to make science-based decisions. So that's certainly a place where we really need people. So I would say there's a few things you can do in that realm. I mean, there's certainly writing and talking about it. A lot of it we found is just making sure that people see that connection between science and democracy and why is this important. And what we found really useful is to take that back to specific issues because that's how you can get it to resonate with a lot more people. So I think you can either go both ways. So look at a specific issue and see how that relates to the bigger science and democracy issues, or you can think about the bigger picture and come up with examples that showcase that. So what we found is there's a lot that can be done to just highlight that example, and a lot of it too is focusing on what we call process issues. So advocating for changes that would allow us to make more democratic science-based decisions. So that's one thing that you can follow and speak out on and write op-eds on and think about ways to push against some of these process issues. For example, making sure that federal advisory boards have unconflicted scientists, that they don't have industry influence on a board that should be science-based, or thinking about voting rights and how that relates to science issues. And so I think there are a lot of just specific issues that do come up. One of them is I'm working on a lot of corporate political spending and how that impacts whether or not we can have climate policies that address climate change. And so I think there's a lot of issues like that you can think to focus on that can really get us to a place where we have a more democratic science-based decision making.
And I would also add that the genesis of UCS was in sort of young scientists, postdocs, young professors being concerned about how science was being misused, and were started to write white papers, organize teach-ins, discuss among themselves, and became eventually 40 years later, a really strong force for change over a wide variety of issues. And I think graduate school and undergraduate is a great place to start that because you're right with other people around you who have the same skills and interests, and not that you have tons of time on your hands, but you do have some freedom and to get your feet wet.
Well, since we're talking about UCS, we have another question here that fits right in, I think. How can you make sure that you protect your credibility as an objective investigator while also having an advocacy agenda? I know that this is a discussion that we have all the time here at UCS. Laura, do you want to take a crack at that one?
Yeah, you really hit the nail on the head. It's a tough balancing act because there's objective facts and stories, but people come to that from a different perspective and may take a different point of view on the same facts, right? And in the policy world, for example, one of the ways you'd make an argument as a scientist is, here's a question I want to answer, here are my premises, here's my here's how I do my research. And here's the answer. And the answer is all of those things together. It's how I did it, what my assumptions were, and here are the error bars. Right? That entire thing is the answer. And in the policy world, that's not the kind of answer that's generally useful. It's not always just yes or no, but it has to be much more sort of concrete than that. And it's a tough balancing act as a scientific person to really balance how far can I push this statement before I don't think it's credible anymore. But it's powerful enough to make a policy change, because it's very tough to make a policy change predicated on an argument with all of these caveats on it. And part of that is sort of scientific literacy and being able to explain your argument well. But some of it is really how do you boil down what I know to the most concrete thing, and that is it's a talent, and we're constantly revisiting it, and we're constantly checking in. In a place like UCS, we have technical and scientific staff, and we also have advocates, people who are lobbyists, and we also have people who are communications people and writers, and they will constantly interrogate us as analysts. Can you say this? What about this? And you keep revisiting that to make it the strongest possible thing that you feel very, that you can back it up.
Gretchen, did you want to try to tackle that one as well?
I think Laura said it well.
Okay, great. Well, we have a question here from Seth. Are there any policy career paths that are currently in higher demand?
Right, I'm trying to think. I don't know if I know of a specific path. Part of it is you can follow what's generally in the news more, what kind of gets a bigger interest from the public at the moment. I think there's certainly things where we could always use more people that know how to communicate that issue well. I think one of them that comes to mind for me, I don't know if Laura would agree, but energy seems to be a place where there's a lot of always kind of needs for people who can translate that energy and the economics around it and the science behind it and what will be feasible in the future, and just thinking about a lot of those bigger issues. But yeah, I think a lot of it too, another thing to just keep in mind that we hadn't said yet is a lot of your specific scientific expertise that you had in graduate school or in an academic career isn't as directly going to be applicable to what kind of science policy career that you have. And it's, for a scientist, I think it's hard to let go of that, because you spent years, becoming an expert on this particular topic. But a lot of science policy jobs that you might encounter are going to be a lot broader, even if it is on that topic. So that's another thing to keep in mind too, that often, having a breadth of expertises or showing that you can, demonstrating that you can know and do science a lot broader than the subject you specifically studied can really help get you into a science policy position.
Right. I think we have a related question here, well, somewhat related. Would you expect that funding for environmental research and sustainability will increase, decrease, or remain constant over the next 5 to 10 years? I know that these are not fields that Gretchen and Laura, you work with, on every day, but do you have any thoughts on that?
I guess I hope so. I hope it's
Yeah, I think we all know it's one of the caveats of being in a science policy world is that it's dependent on the politics, right? So I think largely that question will sort of depend on what happens with politics and what the next administration is, and the extent to which they are concerned with that, and whether or not there'll be funding, and of course the economy in general. But I certainly don't think it would go away anytime soon as far as the need for people to be in those fields in general.
All right, we have a question here from Samantha. What should I do to prepare for the transition from graduate school to postdoc? How can I enhance my policy and advocacy training at the grad and postdoc levels?
I'll take a crack at that, and I think Gretchen gave a really good overview of that in her talk. But I guess I would just mention a meeting I had this morning with a colleague who now works in a senator's office and is a point person for that senator on technical issues. And when he was an undergraduate, he did a lot of organizing, and I think he organized for marriage equality and did a lot of grassroots things. And then in graduate school, he actually was in a program which allowed you to take a sabbatical, and he took a year and a half off to work on a political campaign. And so while these pieces weren't, again, directly relevant to a specific policy issue area, they really demonstrated the ability to work with a wide range of people, to develop realistic policy goals, and to be a good advocate, and basically to get familiar with how decisions get made. And that's one of the things that you need to actually learn, sort of a content area that you'll actually need to learn. You have all these skills, but how do decisions get made in Congress and in the government, or even in the state and local levels, and where are the effective levers to make things happen? So really getting your feet wet in any kind of issue that you're driven by will benefit you. So I would encourage you to, if you have precious free time, but to use it on something that you're passionate about and learn those skills.
Yeah, I think Laura's right about those, and I would just add quick to tell Samantha that if you're going into a postdoc and you already know that that's your interest and you want to try to later transition into a policy advocacy space, I would say to just really actively pursue finding opportunities to do things in that arena, because when you're in the academic space, like I said, that it might not be valued for you to be doing those things. So there are tons of opportunities, I would say, in the academic world to think about policy and advocacy and use your skills in that way, but they're not going to be presented to you. You have to sort of pursue them, because in the academic space, of course, the pressure is on publishing and doing the science and thinking really within that specific world. And so I found there's actually a lot of things on campus that you can do to just either to be an organizer or an advocate on campus, and especially as a grad student or postdoc, you typically have had you've had experiences at different universities, and so you've seen how things are and how things could be, and what could be different or better at institutions. And I found that it helped me have a lot better way to have a lot more knowledge about how to change things just within the campus, or to take leadership positions, because you had the experience and other skills. And a lot of grad students and postdocs don't get involved in student activities or in thinking about bigger issues on campus. And so a lot of times that means there is, opportunities are almost easier to find because there's less people competing for them. And so I would just always consciously be thinking about what you can be doing outside of your space, and in addition to your postdoc.
Great. Well, we have time for just one more question, and I think it's a perfect question to wrap up. Can you recommend any good networking groups or events to meet scientists in the policy field?
Yeah, there's a few things. Certainly, I would start with looking for any sort of city-specific things that exist. In a lot of the major cities with like DC, New York, or Boston, there'll be a lot of local groups that might specifically deal with science policy. Beyond that, there's a few good ways to do it through national conferences and organizing. A lot of scientific societies that have major conferences, they'll have a public affairs section, or they'll have a group or a session that focuses on that specifically. And so anytime you are at an academic conference for anything, pursue those opportunities and look for that. And I'd also maybe do a plug for Science Online as an organization that does, they're sort of specifically looking at social media aspects of communicating science, but there's a lot of people within that group that are involved in science policy realms, and a lot of science writers and people that know things. And the other thing I would just echo what I think Laura mentioned early on is to interview people and do tons of informational interviews and just ask people, how did you get started here? Do you know anyone else doing anything different in science policy? And I think you'll be surprised. People are generally very happy to give you some of their time and tell you about how they got started where they are. And so I would think definitely reach out to people and don't be afraid to ask them how they got there.
Yeah, I agree with Gretchen. For the price of a cup of coffee, you can get a lot of good advice from someone. And also, UCS is present at a lot of national conferences, and we have city meetups. And really, that's one of our missions, is to foster these connections and these interests in public policy. So really keep a close eye on UCS events.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Laura and Gretchen. With that, we're going to wrap up. And thank you all for joining us today. I'll be following up with you after the webinar to share some of the resources that we mentioned today. And I'd also like to point out that we will be posting the recording of the webinar on the Science Network workshop page, hopefully by next week. So if you'd like to go back and rewatch it or pass it along to colleagues, you'll be able to do that. I just want to thank our speakers again and thank all of you for joining us. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.